We are now in part 4 of our introduction to high leverage practices, explicit instruction, and writing conditions for IEP goals. All right, we're going to finish up explicit instruction as systematic by talking about backwards design. And what is backwards design? Well, really, what it means is that you start with your end goal and you work backward from there. So you first decide, like, what do I want my students to learn? What is that final result that I'm shooting for? So what you're going to do is start that. You're going to decide, what do you want your students to know, to understand, or to be able to do? And so really you're looking at your learning goals and those objectives here. So this is what I want to end with. After you decide what you want that end result to be, you then determine what is the acceptable evidence. And so what you ask yourself is, how will I know if my students have mastered or reached that desired result? So what you're going to do is you're going to plan your assessments so they provide the evidence that your students have learned or are learning what you want. Again, thinking about that final goal, that end result that you want, and then we're going to plan our assessment to inform that, to let us know if the students have reached that final goal. And then we're going to plan our learning and our instruction. So you're going to say, what learning experience or instruction will help the students achieve whatever that final goal is? And so you're going to make sure that your instruction is engaging and it directly targets that goal. So think about that. You started at the end with what you want the result to be. You looked at what your assessments would be so you would know that your students have reached that end result or goal. And it's not until you've done those things that you plan your instruction and your activities. And so really this has ongoing feedback. So you're going to monitor students' learning. And as always, you're going to adjust your instruction based on your learners' needs. And so let's look at an example of that. So if I were starting by identifying the goal, that end point, that result I want to reach, I might say to myself, you know what? At the end of this lesson or at the end of this unit, what I want students to be able to do is to fluently multiply single digit numbers. So that's what we're working on, multiplication. But it's not just being able to do it, I'm looking at fluency. So then I have to decide, what is the evidence? How am I going to assess whether or not students can fluently multiply single digit numbers? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have them complete a 20-item multiplication fact quiz, and I want them to complete it within 5 seconds. And what my hope is, how I'm going to know that they're proficient, that they've mastered that skill, now this is only for this one lesson, is that they would score at least 85%. Now, remember, if this was an IEP goal, we need to see that mastery across time. But for this, what I'm looking at is multiplication fluency, and I'm going to assess them. That's my next plan, using that 20-item multiplication fact quiz, and I'm going to assess them within a 10-minute, a 5-minute window, and mastery is going to be at least 85%. And it's not until I know those things that then I plan my instruction. So I'm going to introduce multiplication because it's really a repeated addition. I'm going to introduce it as repeated addition. Then we're going to use arrays, and we're going to use equal groups, and we're going to use number lines to build my students' understanding of multiplication. Then I'm going to provide them with guided practice, and we're going to use manipulatives, and then I'm going to fade the manipulatives because I'm doing my scaffolding to visuals. And then once they're able to do it with visuals, I'm going to have them do it without visuals because, again, I'm scaffolding within that guided practice. And then I'm going to move to fluency practice, and we're going to do that with games and with time drills. So you can see I started with my end goal, and then I looked at my assessments, decided on how I'm going to assess those students to know if they reached that end goal. And once I determine that assessment, then I'm going to plan my instruction. All right, so what I want you to do right now for number 5 is describe backwards design, that backwards planning in your own words. All right, describe it in your own words. So go ahead and stop your video, and after you respond to that in your participation document, come on back and we'll move forward. All right, so we talked about explicit instruction being systematic. So another way it's systematic is you ensure that your lessons are organized and focused. And we do that in explicit lessons, instruction lessons by following a very clear structure. That's why we have an opening, a body, and a closing. And then we have those components of each of those because that organizes our instruction and it keeps it focused. So what it helps students do is that it helps teachers stay focused. It maximizes your instructional time. It minimizes distractions, and all of that minimizes distractions and destruction. And destruction. And all of that supports students' learning. And so, again, here we're going to use that explicit instruction format that we've been talking about. So why does that organization matter? Well, it helps students learn more efficiently. It increases their opportunities to learn, their opportunities to respond. We'll talk about opportunities to respond later, but it increases their opportunities to learn. It reduces any kind of wasted time, instructional time, because it's very organized. It improves students' outcomes. You can imagine what it would be like if you taught a lesson that was unorganized. So students learn best when lessons are predictable and structured. So without organization, students become overwhelmed. They can be confused. It can be hard for them to make progress. But when it is organized, there are very clear steps. It builds their confidence, and students can make steady progress. It helps them understand, it builds their confidence, and it helps them succeed. Look at this. I used AI to make these little graphics. They did a great job. I input what I wanted them to say, and they came up with a visual. All right, talking more about explicit instruction being systematic. You want to use instructional routines because these routines help students focus their learning. One of the things I love about using the same routine, keeping that same routine, is students know what to expect. They understand what your expectation is. They can anticipate what comes next, and you don't have to teach a new routine every time. It's very systematic. We use the same routine every time we teach this skill, for example. And it takes less energy from you. Anything you can take away, you can help that makes your job easier and your planning easier as a teacher is helpful. So it's there's less time trying to figure out the procedures and the students trying to figure out the procedures. And so there are lots of benefits to making sure. I'm going to tell you, teach your routines. Teach your routines. There are lots of benefits to it. When you have consistent routines and take the time to teach them, explicitly teach them, your lessons are more efficient. Learning is more efficient. Students are more engaged. If I know what you expect me to do, I'm going to be more engaged because I'm not sitting around waiting on you to tell me. You have less classroom management issues because students are engaged and know what to do. You have more time for instruction, more time for practice because you're not having to teach a routine every time. And so here again is an example of organization and structure. And this is is a structure, a framework that we will be learning this semester. So again, when we think about it, here's a star up there. Explicit, when we talk about explicit instruction being systematic, remember it focuses on critical content. You break complex skills into smaller chunks or steps. With explicit instruction, you make sure that you teach skills in a logical sequence, that your lessons are organized and focused, and that you use consistent instructional routines. So what I want you to do right now for number 6 is I want you to think about a time, this is for your participation document, when you were trying to learn something new. It could be when you were learning to drive, you were learning a sport, you were learning a new job. What would likely happen if the instruction was not taught in a clear step-by-step sequence? What do you think would have happened? All right, go ahead and stop your video and then come right back and we'll move forward. All right, I look forward to seeing what you think would have happened. So what I want you to do now is to do that self-evaluation, check your understanding, and I want you to make sure that you include any questions you might have in your participation document, and I will see you in our next video.